Okay, so the next step in preparing for a client session is figuring out how you're going to take data. Why do we take data? We take data to track client progress over time. Without data, it would be hard to tell if a client had made any improvement over the course of a quarter. When we take data, we not only get to see big picture progress, we can also see how our clients make progress from one session to the next. Taking data is also important to figure out if the intervention method we are using is effective. If we are taking data, we can see if the client isn't making progress and change the intervention method to see if that makes a difference. We can also make changes to our intervention to make it more effective. For example, if I notice the client's performance drops at the beginning of every week, I might offer home practice for the client to do over the weekend. Or I might notice the client's handwriting continues to be poor after a week of intervention and decide to change the kind of paper or writing utensil the client is using to see if that makes a difference. Taking data makes it easier to see the differences in client performance and makes us better equipped to develop an effective intervention method for our client. But what are we taking data on? Well, that depends on your goals. To determine what your goals are, you're going to go through the client's file to see what they have worked on before, how they did with those goals, and what other areas they might benefit from working on. You are also going to talk to the parents or caregivers, and maybe even the client themselves, to see what their primary concerns are. All of these data points will start to point to some goals you might target. You might start with broad target areas like behaviors, productions, or performance and narrow that down until you have something more specific. For example, if you have a client that has a lot of behavior challenges that negatively impact their life, like children who struggle with pragmatics, you might be thinking about a target behavior like eye contact or turn taking in therapy. If you have a client that is really hard to understand, you might focus on a production goal like getting the client's S to sound like S instead of Th. If the client's handwriting is really hard to read, you might target a performance goal like improving handwriting. Whatever you target, it should be based on helping the client effectively communicate and take into account the family's preferences, current evidence-based practices, and your clinical expertise. Once you have determined what your goals will be, you want to figure out what kind of data you're going to be taking. The first step here is deciding if your data is going to be quantitative, qualitative, or a mix of the two. Qualitative data is information that can't be expressed as a number. It's words, objects, pictures, observations, and symbols that answer how or why something happened. Quantitative data is data that can be expressed as a number or can be quantified. It's going to be numbers and statistics and answer the questions how many, how much, and or how often. The question you're asking yourself is, can I count this? And it might be that you decide to count specific behaviors, or you decide to describe what behaviors you see in a certain period of time. Whatever you decide, you want to make sure that it's going to be representative of what you are observing and line up with what your goal is. The next question is how you're going to take data. This is going to be largely dependent on your client and your goal. You might have your client take data if you're working on metacognitive skills or their awareness. For example, if you want your client to be able to identify when they make accurate or inaccurate productions or rate their productions, you might have them take data on the session or an activity. On the other hand, you might have a client that is sensitive to taking data, in which case you might choose to take data at the beginning or end of a quarter, or taking data based on a recording of each session. You also might have a client that doesn't care if you take data and you can just take data in every session. This is going to be dictated in part by your client and in part by what your goal is. Some goals are going to lend themselves better to more intermittent data collection, while others are going to warrant more frequent data points. So how do you decide how to take data? As with most things, your supervisor is likely going to have an opinion or suggestions for how you take data. Your client may also change the way that you take data, as we talked about earlier, and the data that you're tracking also can change how you're taking data. Once you have decided what data you're tracking and how you're going to track it, you can create a chart to track your data. I'll show a series of different examples of data tracking and talk about how each one works. This first one is collecting data on voice stop consonant production using a queuing hierarchy. The queuing hierarchy is a good tool if you're working with a client that has a motor speech impairment or something where they need extra support to achieve accurate productions. The queuing hierarchy allows you to measure reductions in support over time while maintaining a high production accuracy. With the queuing hierarchy, you provide as much support as the client needs to achieve an accurate production and write the number that corresponds with that level of support in the appropriate box. For example, the client needed a complete model, visual access to the clinician's face, hand cues, segmentation, and verbal instruction to produce bird. So I would write 4 in the box for trial 1 for initial B production. If our next word is blue, and I provide all the same support I provided for bird, but the client still does not make an accurate production, then I would put a 5 in the box for trial 2 for initial B production. And so on and so forth until you have finished 10 trials. Then you add up all the trials and divide by 10, the number of trials, which gives you their average queuing level. The average queuing level goes in the last box, and this is the number that you report on your SOAP. Over time, if your intervention method is effective, your average queuing level will go down, which reflects more independent performance on the part of the client. Okay, so this data collection sheet is very similar to our last one, but instead of a queuing hierarchy, we have a production accuracy hierarchy. Production accuracy hierarchies are useful for clients that are either going to have a very hard time achieving accurate production or will not achieve accurate production. The accuracy hierarchy allows us to measure an increase in accuracy that a typical right and wrong data collection style doesn't have. The data collection method is similar to a queuing hierarchy in that you are writing down the corresponding number. For example, if the client says zebra instead of zebra, we would put a 0 in the first box for initial Z, and so on and so forth until we've completed all 10 trials. Then we add up all those trials and divide by the total number of trials, in this case 10, and we get an average. That average goes in the last box. All of this is the same with both the queuing hierarchy and the production accuracy hierarchy. The difference is, with the queuing hierarchy, we want that average to go down, which indicates the client is gaining independence with the skill. Well, in a production accuracy hierarchy, that number is going to go up over time, indicating that the client is more closely approximating accurate production. Okay, so the next chart on this slide is tracking possessive pronoun use, which is going to follow a more standard correct-incorrect data tracking. This tracking is going to be effective for behaviors that are easy to mark as present or absent or correct or incorrect. In this example, I would give the client an opportunity to say his or him and see if the client says it. So I might ask the client, whose jacket is this? And let's say the client says he's, which would mean I would mark the client did not produce his or him when he should have. Here I'm using a dash to mark incorrect. So let's say that I then ask the client, whose dog is this? And the client says his. I would then mark that client did produce his when he should have. So I'm going to use a check mark to count toward accurate production, and so forth until I finish all the trials. Then I would count up how many times the client got it right, in this case the check marks, and divide that number by the number of trials, in this case 10. So 6 check marks divided by 10 trials is 0.6, and then I'm going to convert that to a percentage by multiplying it by 100. So this client was correct in 60% of the trials, which I would then put in the percent correct column. That is the number that I'm going to report on the SOAP, and over time, I would hope it would go up, reflecting an increase in correct productions. In some cases, you might have a client who's working on a skill where they are writing something down. In this case, you might not be taking live data, you may be using the sample that they write and taking data on it after the session ends. In this example, we have a handwriting sample that the client wrote. During the session, the clinician prompts the client to write something, but they're not necessarily taking data. I say not necessarily because you might choose to make notes about the writing conditions, like what they're writing with, what their distraction level is, and kind of things like that during the session. And then after the session, the clinician would take the handwriting sample and take data from that. In this case, we're looking at legibility. So can you read what each word says? And accuracy. Are the letters appropriately sized? Are they touching the bottom line? Kind of things like that. So we would look at the sample and ask ourselves, or another person if you want an unfamiliar reader, can I read what this says for each word? If I can read it, it counts as legible. So for this, I would say a Yeti is more rude because a Yeti, and then I know that the client was trying to write eats people for the last two words, but I struggle to decipher what these two words are, so I count these as illegible. Then we count the number of legible words, 8, and divide that by the total number of words, 10, which gives us 0.8. We then multiply this number to get a percent legibility score, 80%, which we then would report on the SOAP. For accuracy, we are looking at whether the letters are accurate. Do they touch the bottom line? Are they appropriately sized? Is the spacing between the words and within the words good? And things like that. So the A looks good. The Y in Yeti looks like a capital letter, but it should be a lowercase, so that would be counted as wrong. The E is grounded, but it looks like it could be an O, so that would be wrong. The T looks good. It touches the bottom line and has an appropriate height and size. And the I touches the bottom line, but the dot is a little too high, so that would be wrong. And so on and so forth. I'm only going to do the first line of text as an example, but you would be doing this for the whole writing sample for both legibility and accuracy measures. After you went through and marked the letters as correct or incorrect, you would count up how many letters were accurate or correct, in this case 9, and divide that by the total number of letters, 20, which would give us 0.45 or 45%. A similar process can be done to measure reading ability. I find typing up the passage that the client is going to read is helpful so that you can make marks as the client is reading. So for this passage, the client would be reading from the book, and you would be marking the words that they get wrong on your copy of the passage. So if the client was reading this and says, I was hurrying home in the night when I saw a man coming toward me, I would mark dark and walking as wrong. If they continue reading and say, do you know what time it is? I said, asked. I would mark asked as a self-corrected word. That means that the client initially said the wrong word, in this case said, but noticed their error and corrected it independent of feedback. When I'm counting for accuracy, I'm only counting the words that the client read when I count total number of words. So in this example, I would stop counting here because we stopped reading at asked. I would then count the number of words that the client read correctly, 21, and divide it by the total number of words read, 24, which gives us 0.87 or 87% accuracy. And our last example is another example of a form that the client might fill out during a session that you would then take data on later. So these are two forms that the client may be asked to fill out in a session. For the Get Ready, Do, Done form, you would give the client a craft or an activity and ask them what steps they need to create it. So if we were asking the client to make this, they would list the materials they need under Get Ready. For example, they might say popsicle sticks, clothespins, and glue. It doesn't matter much if they don't list all the materials. Like they might also need paint for this. And if they're not specific, like what kind of glue are they going to use, that doesn't matter as much. So under Do, they list the steps that they would need to do to make the craft. So they might say, glue 2 popsicle sticks to the clothespins as wings, glue a small popsicle stick to the clothespin as a tail, and glue another small